Today's March the 4th, 2005. It's virtually 2 months to the date since my father went into a National Health Hospital to have what we thought was going to be a straightforward hip operation. Since that time, we've actually been through a living hell. A chap who had been healthy, active, driving around North London in his little car, tending his garden, has ended up actually at the jaws of death 3 times as a result of what has happened in Barnet Hospital.
Angie Mason had more to worry about than most after her father ended up in Barnet intensive care following a routine operation. 2 years previously, her mother had gone through something similar in the same hospital. Treatment for a minor stroke that turned into a major infection, a fight for life, and then, sadly, her death. Angie's a TV journalist, so she started recording her father's treatment on a secret camera. What you're about to see is Angie's personal story, an investigation of what happened to her father. But the issues she looked into are very real for all of us. 500,000 people die every year, 2/3 in hospital, and no one knows how many of those deaths are caused by poor care or hospital-acquired infections or superbugs. That's partly because of flaws in the way death certificates are recorded. This is one person's story in one hospital, but it could happen in any hospital.
My father, Thomas Stobbs, was a Marine in World War II, where he'd fought in Egypt and then Italy. He was a tough guy. And it was in Tuscany that he met Silvana Rossi, who he brought back to Newcastle-on-Tyne as a war bride. So my family was a mix of Geordie and Italian. In his later years, Tom developed arthritis in his hip. Nothing too serious nowadays. And in early 2005, he went into Barnet Hospital, North London, for a hip operation.
Can you open your mouth for me? I'm just going to suction the back of your throat, okay? Open your mouth.
The operation went well, but within a day, things were going wrong.
Yeah.
Oh! He just went from being somebody who was coming out quite nicely from his hip operation to somebody who was writhing in pain, screaming to die, totally at loss about what had happened. We couldn't get a straightforward explanation from the staff.
The collapse in Tom's health happened while he was on the general ward. After pressure from me and his GP, he finally got transferred to intensive care, where he was hooked up to 3 life support machines and not expected to live.
We're just doing turning.
All right, okay.
With the dedicated care of Dr. Wolf and his team, he started to pull through. But once out of immediate danger, though, he was put back on a general ward. One evening we found him very ill with his heart monitor bleeping away for 10 minutes, but ignored by the nurses, who said they were unfamiliar with the machine. On top of that, while on the general ward, they fed him solid food when he was only meant to have liquids. I felt that his care wasn't up to scratch.
When I think back of how he was 2 months ago, he was in very, very good fettle for an 87-year-old. And I look at him now on the bed in the hospital, and, you know, my heart misses a beat every time. I just think, what on earth have they done?
So you've had a good day? Huh?
Yeah.
Yeah?
She's still sleepy, Tommy. Yeah.
What you been doing with yourself, then? Huh?
A good sleep.
A good sleep. A good sleep.
Yo-yoing between intensive care and general wards, he kept on getting infections and even became unconscious. I thought his life was slipping away on the general ward. I knew that Barnet was one of the worst hospitals for superbugs. A Department of Health survey published whilst my dad was in hospital put it bottom of a national list with 60 reported cases of MRSA. I tried all sorts of tactics to get him back to intensive care. Speaking to the head of nursing in the hospital, consulting my MP. As a last resort, I contacted a solicitor.
There is a silent majority, I'm afraid, who tend to accept their lot and not ask questions. But I do find there's a coherent minority who will rattle the cage and get some significant results by being inquisitive and demanding, quite bluntly. This was amazing that despite the intervention of people far more competent than me, I feel, a GP and a member of Parliament, we still had this wonderful man, a war hero, who was self-sufficient in a terrible way in a general ward. I wrote to the chief executive of the hospital asking for a patient's immediate return to intensive care. Fortunately, that happened.
You won't be able to talk while you have your ice lolly because they don't like it going down into your lungs. Here's the ice lolly. Should we get one of these made up with Newcastle brown ale? Oh shit, I've dropped it on the bloody floor now.
Where did it go wrong? Why? How? Nobody seems to know, and I'm sure that he's not alone. In fact, I know he's not alone, because my own mother went through something similar in the same hospital 2 years ago. She came in as a 76-year-old with suffering from a minor stroke, was then sent out home for a rehabilitation weekend, generally on the road to recovery. She was then taken back into Barnet by myself and my dad on the Tuesday, almost just for signing off. We went back the next day and she was a different person. An infection just ran through her body, and on the Sunday she was dead. Same hospital that my dad's in. Perhaps it's bad luck that one family has been hit by lightning in the same place twice. You go into the same hospital entrance, you're at the point where you're told that your mother has died. And I'm now going back through those same routes, those same steps for my father, and living the horror of that Sunday and thinking, is it going to happen to him?
With my own mother, I was never given what I felt was a credible explanation of why she died at Barnet. And I thought this time, with my dad fighting for his life, I need my own proof of how Barnet had treated him. I'd just done some undercover filming of other people's stories, but here I was, right in the middle of my own.
Tell me how you are today.
Just about the same, Angie.
Just about the same. Do you feel any better?
Well, I'm lying down here day after day.
How long do you think you've been in for? About what? 4 weeks? No, longer than that. Yeah, it's 8 weeks.
He still is in intensive care, croaking Dalek-like through his voice box, and was sitting up, and talk was of him starting to be hoisted up on a crane and able to walk, to try out the new hip. Remember the new hip? The start of it all. So talk was of him doing this, but they had to abort those because he's now got a full-blown, really nasty infection, I'm told, to such a degree that he's now into an isolation room in intensive care. It's a particularly nasty bug that he's got, and they're really frightened that he's going to expose other patients, other vulnerable patients. And we all have to go in wearing gloves and plastic aprons, etc.
In a passing conversation with a nurse, she let slip that my dad had what she called C. diff. We didn't know what this was. The doctor didn't even mention it. We were soon to find out. It was a serious hospital-acquired infection.
Clostridium difficile, commonly called C. diff, it's a bug that occurs in nature in people's intestines. The sort of people that get problems with C. diff are patients who've had antibiotic treatment for other things. And it's particularly nasty in old folks because they can't cope with that kind of insult, basically. There's quite good evidence a new strain has appeared which is even better at getting around hospitals than the old C. diffs, and it's nastier. If the hospital's hygiene is a bit dodgy, if they're not looking after the patients properly and there's not hand washing, well, that just helps the C. diff to spread. And when the C. diff strain itself has evolved to be even better at hanging in there in hospitals, well, that partly explains why we have such a problem with it just now.
So gradually getting you moving a bit. Come on, do your exercises.
Despite his several ongoing infections, with help from his granddaughter and me, my dad was still battling to live.
12, 13, 14.
He's pretty miserable. He's angry. He was mouthing at us last night and we managed to lip read, and he was saying, they're trying to kill me, they're trying to kill me. I mean, I think he's got a sense of death, but I think he feels that he's not dying, they're killing him. Things are pretty grim now. I think he's had so many kind of bad turns. I've just been in to see him today, and it's heart-rending, actually. It's really sad. But he's there, and he hears my voice, and I think he recognises it, and he's moving his arms and likes occasional drops of water put into his mouth. So, I think he realises it's me. Well, my worst fears have been confirmed, and my father died a few days ago. Actually, when I was at work in the morning, got a phone call saying, look, you better come quickly because his heartbeat is not very good and his breathing is very weak. I get the feeling that they'd kept him going by saying, Angie's coming, Angie's coming. And I got there and he died 15 minutes later. So it's all a bit horrible. But, it was very peaceful. They say pneumonia is the old man's friend, that it's a very kind of peaceful and undramatic way to die. He just kind of fades away, and the heartbeats on the monitors just gradually get slower and slower. So obviously it's been a really emotional time for us all because I just feel so angry. Really, really angry that somebody who was not ill when he went into hospital has to endure all of that pain and suffering and complications because of unexplained medical and nursing diagnoses.
To lose one parent in a hospital is upsetting. To lose both with unexplained causes is pretty devastating. As if it weren't enough that we were having to handle all the upset and grief, when I went in the next day to pick up the death certificate, I found to my absolute horror that the primary cause was pneumonia, the contributory cause was bleeding duodenal ulcer. I knew this couldn't be right. Where are the events that led to the pneumonia? Why a bleeding duodenal ulcer? A death certificate should normally have 3 lines in section 1, with the bottom line giving the most likely underlying cause of death. Government death statistics are based on this crucial last line. My dad's death certificate seemed incomplete. Where was 1B? And the all-important 1C? What we wanted is an accurate reflection of how a fit and healthy man had a routine hip operation that went wrong.
I don't like to think that there's anything deliberately misleading from the hospital that they're trying to obfuscate. I don't think so, because the consultant himself is a very, very nice man and genuinely upset at my father's death.
Sorry about things.
Well, it's not your fault, Dr. Wolfe.
We were very fond of him. He was
Well, he's a
good to
character.
look after.
I felt uncomfortable putting this doctor from intensive care, who had looked after my dad really well, in this awkward situation. But I had a death certificate which seemed wrong. I'd made up my mind to have an independent post-mortem.
I said you're going to want a post-mortem, that's right.
You know, and I know that your unit really helped him towards the end, and, you know, I have to give credit to that. But, you know, there's been some mess up earlier on. I think I have a right to know, and nobody's told me. Well, I
in
think
some senses, I think you would be happier, and in a sense, I think I always feel we would be happier if somebody else did it, so that there could be no argument that, you know, in 6 months' time, you feel that something wasn't looked into enough, or that we were ignoring things.
At my personal expense of £400, I had my father's body taken to a mortuary for a post-mortem.
As you know, you asked me to do an autopsy because you were upset by the fact that the cause of death written on the death certificate did not represent, as you see, what happened to your father. I think your father is a very interesting example. Here's a man who's fit, in his mid-80s, who walks into hospital voluntarily to have an elective operation to get his hip done, and 90 days later comes out dead. If one just stood back and say, why is he dead? It would seem fairly logical to think that if he hadn't had his operation, would he be dead now? The answer is absolutely not. And barring some untoward accident, he would still be alive. Therefore, it would seem reasonable to say, well, something related to the operation or what happened afterwards must be related to his cause of death. And yet, as you know, what was put on his death certificate was 1, pneumonia, and 2, bleeding duodenal ulcer. And that doesn't seem to reflect what happened to him in terms of having an operation and going downhill thereafter. So, having made the examination, I concluded that what he actually died of was this rather complicated form of pneumonia due to post-operative complications. But fundamentally, what your father died of actually was having a hip operation.
If one of your students had filled in my dad's death certificate, how would you mark it? I mean, would you have failed it?
I would have marked it as unacceptable. In the true sense, it has not represented what happened. It is not satisfactory or good, it is unacceptable.
Armed with Professor Lucas's post-mortem, I wrote to Dr. Wolfe asking him if he would be willing to amend the death certificate. He wrote back confirming he would. Finally, I thought I was getting somewhere. Throughout all this process, I felt as if I was the troublemaker. But a nagging feeling made me wonder if perhaps I was not alone in all this. So I went to see Dr. Aileen Clark, who did research on death certification for a major report for the Home Office.
Who's responsible for recording deaths?
Well, it's a legal duty of doctors to write a death certificate. If it's a GP, they write the certificate themselves. But in a hospital, it often gets handed down the line to a more junior doctor.
Are they legally obliged to get it accurate?
Well, you would hope so. You would hope so. But we've been doing some research on death certificates, and we've found that they're not as accurate as you would hope they would be. Some of the research that's been published, for example, by two people called Swift and West, found that 55% were properly completed. Well, that leaves rather a large proportion not properly completed and not properly filled out.
If 45% of death certificates are wrong, that means in the last 12 months, nearly 250,000 inaccurate certificates have been issued.
The certificates are wrong either because the doctor doesn't know why the patient has died, but to keep the system turning over and not to distress the relatives will make up something that is plausible. And sometimes he does know, but for reasons of not wishing to distress himself, the relatives or his colleagues, when he suspects neglect or malpractice, is quite likely to give an acceptable reason.
Dr. Richard Wyndham should know. He's worked in hospitals and been a GP before becoming a medical referee in a crematorium. He was responsible for checking all the paperwork related to death before a body could be cremated.
What I see is the cremation forms, which are supposed to give me a very good picture of why the patient died. And it's supposedly coherent, it's supposedly knowledgeable, truthful, and all the rest of it. In many cases, it's none of these things.
I was intrigued by a story I'd read about a man who stubbornly refused to play by the rules. When Tim Cheadle's dad, a champion darts player, was diagnosed with lung cancer in a hospital in Portsmouth, Tim found he had more to deal with than his dad's ill health.
In my case, I can say, look, when my dad died, you know, I wasn't at my best. Let's just put it like that. You know, I really didn't need any of this hassle, right? My attitude is something's rubbish, walk away. We get a phone call and my dad's been taken into isolation and he's caught MRSA.
Well, they were open about it, were they?
Yeah, totally open. So there was no doubts that he had MRSA. My dad died at 1 o'clock in the morning, so there wasn't any doctors around, it was just the nurses and it was all very peaceful. So the following day I went to the bereavement office to get the death certificate. So I said, well, I really would like to know how my dad died in the end. And the junior doctor, he said that he had died of pneumonia and the carcinoma of the lung, which is like lung cancer. I asked him straight and I said to him, you know, what about the MRSA? And his quote to me was, you can't die of MRSA because it's just a bug. And I thought, no, sorry, I can't take this. I can't take this certificate off you because that's wrong.
They're just talking rubbish. They don't even know the fundamental, simple, straightforward bacteriology that nurses are taught. Never mind doctors. You know, nurses have a bit of bacteriology in their training. And they will know that a bug like MRSA, Staph aureus, you know, the whole family of bugs can be lethal. No, absolutely no question about it.
In my experience, junior hospital doctors are very largely unsupervised. As an instance of some of the gibberish that they write, it is quite clear that they are not being supervised.
My actual words to the hospital, no, you keep it because it's more use to you than it is to me because that's just a load of rubbish. We couldn't register my dad's death, so therefore there's no funeral.
Tim decided to go for a coroner's post-mortem, which confirmed that his dad had died of MRSA. A new death certificate was issued by the coroner, but Tim also wanted the hospital to apologise.
The law is clear, you know, they're saying that, you know, the law says you do not have to put the organism down in front of the pneumonia. So as far as the hospital is concerned, they haven't broken the law. Even though the death certificate was wrong, we got it changed. It's become an MRSA statistic because we got it changed, but they're not going to apologise for something they haven't done wrong because the law protects them.
Portsmouth Hospital say that they accept the new death certificate. They also say the doctor who wrote the original one made the best clinical judgment at the time, as MRSA could only have been confirmed in a post-mortem.
I will continue through the complaints process. I will not be litigating. I will go through the complaints process, however hard that is to do. And that is what you have to do to make changes. Who's dying of what? Because nobody knows. I mean, it seems like you die of pneumonia if you have a car crash now. Everybody, you know, if you read death certificates, it's like, well, everyone dies of pneumonia.
Some types of illness are very much over-reported. On occasion, having had an unsatisfactory set of papers, I phone the junior hospital doctor and say, what's this about bronchopneumonia? Tell me the story. And out comes a story about an operation, an amputation of a leg or whatever, and of course, contracted MRSA and died. nothing in the medical certificate or the cremation certificate leads the authorities to realise that it's MRSA at fault. And that's what happens.
It is very useful to know what people are dying of. If everyone is dying of heart attacks, ischemic heart disease, then you know where to put the money. If everyone is dying of cancer or something else, you know where to put the money. So significant inaccuracies at this level do in fact impinge on government policy and make health planning difficult.
My dad was probably robbed of 5 or 10 years of his life. But when I read a shocking story of the death of a disabled girl, not much younger than my own daughter, I felt compelled to go and talk to the family.
Gemma, when she was in Abra, used to be in the brownies.
Start with the brownies.
This is when she was on holiday. I think that was Minorca, wasn't it? Yeah. Gemma was a very happy-go-lucky girl.
She was just full of smiles constantly. Her disability just didn't affect her whatsoever because she was so bright.
Understood everything you said. She talked a lot with her eyes, like.
This is the Royal Victoria Infirmary, Newcastle's top-rated 3-star hospital. At the age of 15, Gemma came here for a simple operation and caught a superbug.
They don't really like to say that you've got MRSA. You've got to ask.
It was only by chance that I'd heard the doctors actually talking outside her room about Gemma having MRSA. I actually asked the doctor, and even then he still wasn't going to tell us. This was one of the senior consultants. It was actually a junior doctor that stepped in before the senior doctor actually got to say anything and said, yes, Gemma has got MRSA. She ended up with big sores, you know. She ended up with a hole in her hip, the size of a tennis ball, really, wasn't it? Where the MRSA was actually eating away her skin and her flesh.
What happened when she died? Did they give you a death certificate?
They give us a death certificate, but it's got on pneumonia, you know. It hasn't got nothing about MRSA.
Did you ever feel like confronting them?
No, at the time, I was too soft to say anything anyway, you know.
I just think it's people's rights to know what their relative, like what they've died of. It's like a peace of mind, really, you know. You know what they've died of, you can accept it a lot more. You can't move on with your life knowing that you don't actually know the truth of what your relative has died of.
Dawn then told me another story from a different hospital.
My boyfriend's mum went in with a dislocated shoulder and she fell and split her chin. She caught MRSA and she never come out, she died.
And what was on her death certificate?
Pneumonia.
Yes.
It's a bit of a joke, isn't it, really?
It is. I mean, you know, it's not a laughable thing, but you can actually laugh at the same time, thinking that everybody in the world seems to be dying of pneumonia. They're not dying of anything else these days, you know.
The Royal Victoria Infirmary said that although MRSA led to the demise of Gemma, it was not considered to be a cause of death or even a contributory factor. They also insist that MRSA accounts for less than 1 in 3,000 patients cared for in their hospital. I asked Dr. Wyndham about his own experiences.
If you are in this kind of league table mentality, then everybody wants to be top of the league, and the way you get top of the league is to have the best looking statistics. And of course, doctors are not going to, if they can avoid, saying things which might hold their hospital up to criticism.
So where do you think the pressure was coming from?
I don't know, but a word to the wise, a hint that it might be better for the team statistics not to mention it. It doesn't have to be overt, does it? It doesn't have to be an instruction from on high. But if the culture is such that we don't admit MRSA infections unless we absolutely have to, I don't know.
We know there's an increased incidence, numbers of hospital-acquired infections related not just to operation, but also just being in hospital, having lines put in one. And these may or may not contribute to death if those people die. It's actually quite a fine balance of judgment what they do. But there's been a great tendency never to put them in the death certificate because it looks bad. Gratifyingly, the government, of course, having sense, has produced recent guidelines which say, no, don't be afraid about putting it in, because actually it's quite sensible. If someone has really died with MRSA or another hospital-acquired infection, and this has significantly contributed to their death, it should be put in. And they produced that in their recent guidelines about a year ago. Whether doctors read that and understand it and follow it is entirely another matter.
Everything I'd learnt about hospital-acquired infections, league tables and botched death certificates made me think back to the meeting I had had with Dr. Wolfe just after my dad's death.
I know that death certificates are analysed for, they draw censuses and things like that from them. Yes. And, if there's another 87-year-old, 86-year-old who's thinking of having a hip operation, it should, statistics should show and society should help to make that an easy decision.
I cannot agree with you more. Having said that, I know how death certificates are filled in, and the number of times people just write bronchopneumonia or things like that, and nobody who understands death certificates would ever draw any sensible conclusions from them. It's not like death certificates are particularly. You know what happened to Thomas. He just, things just generally went wrong. He was getting weaker and weaker, and he then got a pneumonia. But pneumonia doesn't really describe what happened with him. I absolutely agree.
I've now realised that both doctors and governments have known about the problems of death certification for years. As I visited my father's grave and thought back about the months of pain that my father had gone through, I realised that when you go into hospital, you've no idea of the risks. If I'd known, I'd never have let him go in. Then I had another unwelcome shock. I received a letter from Barnet Hospital saying that Dr. Wolfe was no longer willing to change my dad's certificate. Real Story asked Barnet for an interview to discuss why they changed their mind. They agreed, provided I wasn't present. Fiona Bruce spoke to Dr. Wolfe.
When you say to Angie things just generally went wrong, she feels that her father came in for a hip replacement operation, which is relatively routine, and yet a number of months later he is dead. An outcome she didn't expect, certainly didn't foresee, and he suffered a number of complications and infections after this operation, which he needn't have.
I think to say he needn't have is, of course we would hope he wouldn't, but as I've explained, when things do start to go wrong, and they indeed did go wrong. He had had heart failure, respiratory failure, kidney failure, C. diff, MRSA. He had had a whole series of things.
Are you satisfied that in no way you or the hospital are at fault here for those things going wrong?
These are his notes. A very large amount of procedures and things were done, diagnoses made, decisions made, and it's impossible for me to say nothing was done wrong. We almost say, but I do not know of a single thing in here that says we did anything wrong.
So
and we
even though this man came in for a hip replacement operation and died, not because of the operation itself, but because of things that happened after the operation and a series of infections and him gradually getting weaker and weaker, you're satisfied that you and the hospital did nothing wrong in the care of Angie's father?
I have to say yes. I know how death certificates are filled in, and the number of times people just write bronchopneumonia or things like that, and nobody who understands death certificates would ever draw any sensible conclusions from them.
As you know, you discussed with Angie the idea of her having an independent post-mortem, which she did.
Yes.
She then discussed the results of that post-mortem with you, and you agreed with her that pneumonia doesn't generally fit what happened to Thomas. So why did you put it on the death certificate?
No, that may have been, those weren't my exact words, and I would have slightly amended those. What I What I intended to mean was that pneumonia did not describe everything. He did have pneumonia. He had pneumonia on at least 3 occasions.
So why did you just put pneumonia on the death certificate when pneumonia was just one thing out of several things that happened to Thomas and didn't describe what happened to him?
All the other things that happened are... I can't fit them all on, and I think it is just as misleading to pick out one and say, okay, well...
You don't have to have one, you can have 3. There's A, B and C.
Yes, but if I've got 10, to condense that all down onto a death certificate is extremely difficult. And to pick one thing, he had had a whole series of things. The thing that I believed and what we have to write down is, to the best of my belief, what he died from was pneumonia.
So what's the point of that death certificate? How is anyone supposed to interpret that?
I would accept, I think the system needs changing. I absolutely accept the system needs changing.
Are you prepared to change the death certificate now?
No. I have done my best on that death certificate, and I feel it would be wrong for me to change the death certificate on the basis of a huge amount of external pressure when I have done what I believe is right. I put the diagnosis which I believed and which has subsequently been confirmed by the pathologist.
Watching that interview left me stunned. More than a year after his death, I learnt my dad had MRSA as well as C. diff. Barnet Hospital accepts that they did have problems in the past with hygiene, but now they claim it's good and getting better, with a strong and sustained reduction in MRSA rates. In England and Wales last year, there were 1,500 official deaths from superbugs. How many more are being hidden from view?
The medical profession, good men, hard-working men, don't want to rock the boat. Why should they? It'll mean more trouble, more paperwork for them. That's always the cry. We've got plenty enough to do as it is, and God knows it's true. I think there is also a very strong pressure on the profession not to own up to, if that's the right expression, things that may be seen or perceived to be critical or attacking the standards of the given institution, the hospital.
Barnet have offered me compensation for my mother, but despite this, they insist she received appropriate care. With regard to my dad's death certificate, I'm still intrigued why a good, caring doctor would reverse his original agreement to change it. How can any health policy be successful based on inaccurate death certificates? I asked Professor Lucas what could be done.
What it needs is a form of surveillance. It needs the principle of 2 heads are better than 1. Instead of doctors doing it by themselves in the privacy of their own rooms and writing down something that is unlikely ever to be challenged or checked, if we had a system whereby there was a sort of independent review as a check to see whether what has been written down and proposed as a cause of death is reasonable given the medical information available, then automatically in one go the quality of death certification would increase.
The fatal fundamental flaws of the certification system in this country, it adds up to the shambles. If the people charged with running the system, for whatever reason, don't run it properly, then it's of no value at all. And that's, I'm afraid to say, is where I think it is.
It seems strange to me in a society where everything is audited, measured and accounted for. We have this one crucial area in the death business that has been allowed to go unregulated. The good news is that the government has just announced changes to the coroner's system to give relatives more rights with death certificates they're unhappy with. The bad news is that details are sketchy and coroners will only deal with deaths referred to them. My local coroner didn't want to know about my dad's case. With over 500,000 death certificates issued every year, are we going to continue accepting that hundreds of thousands of them are still likely to be wrong? I wonder if I'll ever get my dad's death certificate changed.